All right, so in classic our Master Duel fashion, we have yet another person complaining about the speed of Yu-Gi-Oh! So this says, in your opinion, what are the elements that make Yu-Gi-Oh! A game that's, quote, too fast? And I guess for me personally, I like the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so fast. I think that a few of the things that sort of contribute to it are the sort of uninhibited power creep within the game, as many people have pointed out, since each set has to be better than what already exists in the game in order for people to want to buy it. The power curve has sort of ramped up significantly over the years, and it's resulted in a lot of cards and decks being printed that are just absurdly strong. That being said, a movement away from a sort of back row reliant towards a more monster reliant format has also contributed heavily to that. In addition, the prevalence of interaction from the hand, things like hand traps, but also the ability to sort of activate things from the hand, circumvent certain mechanics that are supposed to sort of make the game a little bit slower. Things like being able to activate infinite impermanence from your hand if you don't control anything, like same with evenly matched and stuff like that. The traps that are good have to either win the game instantly or they have to basically function as something other than trap cards. Aside from that, you also have this idea that in order to be worth playing, cards have to either contribute to a larger game plan as part of an engine, or they have to be so strong and so oppressive that like your opponent is forced to deal with them. Things like Imperial Order back when that was legal, anti-spell fragrance, D-barrier, stuff like that. So those are sort of some of the things that come to my mind when I think of the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh has gotten so fast. But we'll have to see what the people on Reddit say. One card starter into full combo is definitely part of it. I think that the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh is built around sort of taking a singular card and trying to convert it into a bunch of advantage. One of the worst offenders in this case is link ones. I think that the prevalence of cards that search a powerful card within the archetype. Take for example a card like the Infant Adignister that searches the field spell, which basically gets the entire game plan rolling. It's such a strong singular card. And the fact that it exists on an extra deck monster that can use any singular Adignister card as its material, then you create a situation where the entire deck is basically one card starters. And the same happened with Prank Kid, where originally Prank Kids had effects that made it where you could basically mitigate the loss in card advantage from fusion summoning using them. But when they printed the deck a Link one, then it became a situation where that effect that was meant to sort of mitigate the issues with fusion summoning and Link summoning to a certain extent, those sort of upsides suddenly turned every Prank Kids card in the deck into a one card starter. Because then, you could summon it, link it off for Meow Meow, and then summon another one from deck and get your entire game plan rolling and basically end on Battle Butler twice on your opponent's turn, and the ability to basically do the entire combo again on the next turn. So I think that one card starters are a huge contributing factor to that, because if you look back, you can see a lot of very strong decks that didn't have that same problem. Let's see what the next one is. The motors. Oh, let me guess. Yeah, I think that the whole like card games on motorcycles meme. I love Little Karibo. He's great. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Bridged is great. But the effect he's had on the greater Yu-Gi-Oh! Community can't be understated, and it's not necessarily all for the good. I get the pun that this guy's trying to go for, but at the same time, it's like, you know, 5Ds was like what, over a decade ago. It's not something that people should be like still reeling over. Okay, cards don't have enough restrictions in terms of activation or archetypal restrictions. So yes and no. I think that in some ways they have no restrictions, and in other ways they have too many restrictions. Like my favorite deck, Hero, has a lot of problems with the deck locking you into heroes. And as a result, you can't really play a lot of the more powerful generic extra deck stuff that you would like to play. Like I think in Nathan Christmas's top 32 deck for, I believe it was the NAWCQ, where he played Hero. I think the only non-hero extra deck card he played was Baguska, and that was, I think, just sort of there as like a insurance policy. If all he could do was get 2 level 4s on the field, he at least had the ability to go into Baguska. Or if he thought the deck he was playing against couldn't out Baguska, he could do that and then sit on Baguska until he could accrue enough resources in order to kill his opponent. But on the other hand, you end up with cards like, Verte, which was an extremely powerful card that needed to be banned. Like if it had required Predaplants as material, it could have propelled Predaplant to being a good deck. Like they could have played powerful fusions, and it probably would have been fine, as the rest of the Predaplant cards aren't even really that good relative to what was like popular at the time. I mean, once Branded came out, Predaplant became sort of an advantage engine in Predaplant, but Branded locks you into fusions. You can't really Verte in a Branded deck, so I don't think that would have been an issue. Same for like Halky Fibrax. The fact that it was a generic Crystron card meant that pretty much any deck that can get a tuner on the field can go full Auroradon combos. I mean, same with Auroradon, not requiring Mecha Phantom Beasts. And like Auroradon had the restriction of not letting you Link summon for the rest of the turn after you use its effect. But Synchros and Xyz are so strong and have gained so much support over the years that being able to go Auroradon still meant you could functionally do anything in the game. So this person says generic cards shouldn't be crazy strong. In other card games, powerful cards have big restrictions, mana costs and magic, supporter limits, and more prize card value of Pokemon. It's crazy that just about every deck now can crap out generic extra deck everything that can kill all interaction through Omnis. Sprite wouldn't be nearly as crazy if it could only summon Sprite monsters. Yes, but the problem is that there needs to be at least some generic stuff, right? Like Sprite isn't the only deck that can summon IP, right? Like a lot of decks use IP. And do you want every archetype to be printed their own IP, Masquerena, or do you just want them all to be able to play the same card? Like, I think the fact that certain cards can be played across multiple decks, for one, it gives a singular card far more use. So, like, I pick up a single copy of Access Code Talker. I picked it up for like $40 when I bought it, but I played it in like 8 different decks, right? So, I've gotten, you know, 8 decks worth of being able to play it. If I had to spend even like $20 on 8 different copies of a card that does the same thing for each deck, that would have been far worse, right? Like, the fact is that having these generic cards, while it does get annoying, it can be a good thing both as a consumer and as a player, because with these generic cards, you know what you need to play around. Like if you look at even cards that are similar to each other, like for example, let's think about cards that function similarly to Trident, right? So Trident was printed as a card within Zodiac, but then they printed other cards that did something similar, and other cards came before it that did similar things too. Like as a hero player, I think about having access to Destiny Hero Dystopia, which has a pop effect. It's a quick effect. And then I think about a Rise Heart, which doesn't pop, but it does banish face down. And then, you have other cards that can do similar things. The fact is that, if there was a card that did that could be played in all three decks, you could hypothetically, have contingency plans for that. But the fact that each different deck has a different card that does it slightly differently means that you can't necessarily plan for that. I can plan for IP, right? I know that a lot of decks are going to want to play IP Masquerena. I can play Infinite Impermanence to be able to out the IP. I can also do things like, play Ash Blossom to out Verte. I can play things like, you know, Infinite Impermanence to, there was a point in time where a lot of decks were activating Azathoth on your turn. And, there were a lot of issues with people not being able to interact with their opponent with hand traps because they would Azathoth on their turn and then continue their combo under Azathoth so their opponent couldn't activate monster effects. The fact is that you can plan for that. If every deck was playing something different, if it was a different lock, if like one deck locked you out of activating traps, one deck locked you out of activating spells, and another out of monsters, but they all had the same line to be able to do that, but they had to pick one, then that would make, playing around it different and they could play into certain things. But the fact that every deck that did that would go into Nyarla because it was a 4 and then stack an Azathoth on top of it, that meant that you could theoretically put cards in your deck that play around it. I remember playing against somebody that was playing the 4-axis, what is it called? It was Lunalight, but it also played the Orcus cards, Lunalight Orcus. And I know for a fact that he stacked the Nyarla and then put an Azathoth on top of it, and I just let it go. But I had picked up my set of Infinite Impermanence. I had an Infinite Impermanence in my hand. He thought he was safe, but so when he went for the play that got him into his Orcus, I impermed it, and he basically had to end his turn because I knew what needed to be done. I knew what was prevalent in the format and how to play around it, and I did. So the fact is that, you know, having these generic cards that are in every deck, while it does sound annoying, there are upsides to it as a player. And this person says, well, the purpose of having those generic strong extra deck cards is so that any deck can have a boss monster without Konami having to print support for archetypes that very few people actually play. That is a good point. Being able to share boss monsters is something that I mentioned, but it's also good for Konami because they don't have to keep printing the same card, because if every deck had to be printed their own access code talker, that would just be annoying. Back in my day, the graveyard actually meant something and not just a second hand. Just one of many things brought on by power creep, but it sticks out to me. So pretty much I would say from the beginning of Yu-Gi-Oh, the grave never meant anything. I know that people like this want to pretend like there was a point in time where sending things to the grave meant that they couldn't be used anymore. But Monster Reborn was printed almost immediately. And there were a lot of cards that interacted with the graveyard. Whether people want to admit it or not, like you could monster reincarnation cards back. There were cards that had grave effects even back then. Like even the people that complain about hand traps, it's like having interaction from the hand goes as far back as Karibo. Like being able to discard Karibo and prevent battle damage was something you could do as far back as like GOAT format, right? And even in GOAT format, the cards that are in your graveyard are always accessible. They are either used as material for Monster Reborn, premature burial, like, you know, you can use them as material for Chaos monsters, some in BLS, some in a CED, some in Chaos Sork. So this idea that like the graveyard meant something at a certain point doesn't really hold water to very much scrutiny. I feel like a lot of people say this, but what they're talking about is a version of Yu-Gi-Oh that they played where they didn't have access to BLS. They didn't have access to Monster Reborn, maybe because it was like an ultra in its first printing. They didn't have access to, a lot of these powerful cards that saw play at high levels of competitive play, but they didn't have access to them on the playground, so they must not have been real at the time. That yeah, this is silly. I mean, even back in the day, zombies made heavy use of the graveyard, although that was their gimmick, which made thematical sense. Now every archetype has graveyard effects, making zombies less interesting. Like this guy, like if the point was a snake, it would have bit this guy. I think although the game is short in terms of turn count, so much happens in one turn. Games are still long in a sense. Floodgates and full negate boards make games feel much faster though, even when one player basically can't interact at all. This guy, he was, he had me in the first half. You know what I'm saying? Like I was with him until he got to that second sentence. Because yes, games don't last a long time in terms of like turn count, but like in terms of the number of actions that happen in a game, the people that feel like games are one-sided blowouts are the people that aren't building their decks properly. Like if your deck doesn't play any hand traps, or if your deck is meant to like set two and pass, and that's like full combo for your deck, like of course it's gonna get blown out by Kashtira. I mean, it will get blown out by Witchcrafter. Like this is not something that's like should be difficult to understand. I think that floodgates and full negate boards, they're not real. Like when was the last time you saw a deck that put up more than one negate? Like even Dragon Link, a deck that is known for putting up a bunch of negates, the most that it does these days is put up a Borreload Savage. The rest of its end board is like it ends on like a Lubellian with like a branded Regained or a branded Beast in the back row. It ends on Seals, which does not negate. It bounces and it might summon a Floodgate, but most people don't play the Amorphages or Quackimiru Drago anymore. Most of the time when you go for Seals, it's either summoning like a Magnum up from deck to be able to add another copy of a dragon in the end phase, or you're just summoning like a random errant material from deck. Like this idea that boards end on a bunch of negates is silly. Like some of the best decks ever end on zero negates. Like Zodiac, where's the negates? It doesn't end on any negates. Um, Tier Limit ends on zero negates. Like you look at Spiral, sure, Spiral had the version that ended on the Trigate Wizard with the negate, but like even then, that's only one negate. What made Spiral so powerful is the fact that like it could play through a bunch of interaction because it had like a billion materials worth of summons, and the fact that it had access to Sleeper, which was basically like a quick effect Raigeki, and the fact that all of the cards were non once per turns and could be looped over and over to gain a bunch of advantage. Like that deck was Advantage City, baby. Like nobody can keep up with the advantage that Spiral could generate in its prime, even after receiving a bunch of hits. Like there were versions of the deck that just plowed through interaction. And the fact is that, you know, any deck can play some of the most powerful negation, because the most powerful negation in the game right now is hand traps. Being able to activate something like Ash Blossom, being able to activate something like Ghost Spell, any deck can play those and draw them and have access to them. So it's like this idea that, you know, boards are like these full negate floodgate boards. Like Konami continues to ban floodgates. They banned Barrier Statue. They banned Scythe. So clearly, if you think that the game is just a bunch of floodgates and boards with like a billion negates, like your Triff, then you're not playing Yu-Gi-Oh at a high competitive level. You're playing against some guy who plays his pet deck that plays a bunch of negates, and you're just playing some pile of garbage that gets blown out every time because you're not playing Ash Blossom. Like that's just the truth. And the fact is that there's a lot more interaction now than there was even in older formats like GOAT, or even formats like, you know, I wouldn't go so far as to say Edison, because Edison's a pretty interactive format. But if you look at games of GOAT, a lot of setting and passing, which some people find that exciting. I personally think it's boring as hell. But, you know, there's a version of Yu-Gi-Oh! That is just, you know, Magic the Gathering, but you don't have to activate lands to do things, right? I prefer the version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where things actually happen. So, I mean, the fact is that unlike, you know, those older games where the length of the game is artificially drug out by the fact that, you know, doing things is only as good as the things that you can undo that your opponent did. In a modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh, the actions happening in a single turn are constantly, you know, they're just constantly doing things. And I think tier limit is the best example, because the fact that like you can, you know, activate something like Havness on your opponent's turn, mill some cards, and if you mill well enough, you can just start playing the game on your opponent's turn. And the thing is like if you're playing against a competent deck, that isn't the end of the game. Like your opponent can, you know, Bestial one of your mills. Your opponent can like, you know, wait till you're done and then start doing their thing. They can, you know, activate one of the shufflers. They can DD Crow. They can Ash. So there's a lot of interaction both on your turn and on your opponent's turn, which makes the game far more interesting, in my opinion. I'm I'm telling you, I I'm telling you, modern decks don't end on very many negates. I don't know what it is with people constantly thinking that every problem this game has boils down to my opponent ending on a singular negate. But y'all need to play better decks. That's all I'm saying. Y'all need to play better decks. Negates aren't the only way modern Yu-Gi-Oh is nuts. Consider how absolutely bonkers oh no. Oh, somebody coming at me trying to tell me that Exa Sister is nuts at breaking boards. This just this just goes to show how out of touch a lot of these people are with the actual game of Yu-Gi-Oh. Like, if you come at me, if you come to me complaining about the current state of Yu-Gi-Oh, you're like, hey, Yu-Gi-Oh right now. Even if you're playing Master Duel, you come to me and you say Yu-Gi-Oh right now, Master Duel right now. Man, it's bonkers. Have you seen this Exo Sister deck? I'm just not going to listen to you anymore. Like that's the end of the conversation. I am checked out. You clearly don't actually know anything about modern Yu-Gi-Oh. Okay, so this is being able to set up a board on tier 0. Cough, tier, cough. Yes and no. Like, yes, the ability for your opponent to play on your turn is crazy, but is it bad? I think it's kind of neat. I think it's pretty sick. Like the ability to like Havness on your opponent's turn and like combo off, that's really cool. And what are things that allow for this to occur? Okay, so ultimately, what happens is Havness is a hand trap. Tier limits Havness. It says if your opponent activates a monster effect, you can special this card from your hand, mill 3. And in tier limit, especially when tier limit had max copies of all of the tier names, hitting a singular tier limit monster means that you can fusion summon. And if you've Havnessed and then hit a tier, you can then go into Kit Kalos, which is currently banned in the TCG, by the way. You can go into Kit Kalos. Kit Kalos can then mill you 5 more. And over the course of those 8 mills, if you hit any of the millers within the Ishizu cards, those can mill 5. And that can start to snowball, meaning that you can start hitting more tier names, going into more fusion summons. Those fusion summons can have effects on summon. Things like, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. I'm not very familiar with the other tier cards. But basically, you can start to sort of end on interaction before you've even had your first turn. And yes, that seems a little unfair, but you also have to understand that the idea of turns is sort of broken down by the fact that, any individual card in your hand can also represent interaction on your opponent's turn. Like, being able to go into a Rule Colosse on your opponent's turn off of a really good Havness mill, how is that functionally different than drawing into an Imperm or an Ash, right? Because it's just a negate, a singular negation, right? And it's not even like super oppressive in that way. So I don't necessarily think that it's like a huge problem. I just think that it was one of the ways that Tier sort of went over the top in terms of sort of dealing with itself almost. You know, this guy has a point. Like, Earth's Arctics can also play on your opponent's turn. Being able to play on your opponent's turn doesn't necessarily make the deck great. Like, another great example of being able to play on your opponent's turn, not necessarily turn 0, but being able to sort of play on your opponent's turn is Orcust having access to Babel. Like, I think that, Orcust being able to sort of do its entire combo again on your opponent's turn does seem kind of unfair, but the fact is that that's sort of where the bar is set, right? Like, if you're playing things like Bestials or hand traps or, quick plays that can sort of be activated at any given time, even during your turn, like, having access to something like, Magnemite or Druis Worm or DD Crow on turn 0, being able to stop your opponent from fusion summoning while still, in the case of the Bestial, putting material on board, like, I think that's fine. Like, it's what made things like Sprite and the like at least a little bit competitive with Tier back when it was Tier 0. So, I mean, to be fair, when you're complaining about Tier Limit was the only deck worth playing at the time when it was full power. And even in Master Duel, when it was pre-hit, it was still the best deck by a lot. So, really, the only thing that really comes up is when you're in the mirror match. And at that point, it's like you're both playing on turn 0, regardless of who went first, assuming the player not going first went drew Havness. But I think to a certain extent, this is a legitimate criticism. I don't think Konami wants people playing on the turn 0 if they're not the person that went first. So I don't think we're going to get more cards like Havness, although I wouldn't necessarily complain about it. No mana system, too many ways to interact with the deck, searching, summoning from deck, using as material, milling, recycling cards in the grave. This is the top 3 reasons for me. So, no mana system has existed from the beginning. Too many ways to interact with the deck, searching, summoning from deck, using as material, milling. These are all things that existed from the dawn of Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that over time they started sort of leaning into these things as like the primary way to gain advantage. Like you look back at really old formats, you can see cards like reinforcement of the army, cards like terraforming, being able to sort of just, have a bunch of copies of cards that tutor for whatever you need at any given time. Those have always existed. And then you have cards like Foolish Burial, you have cards like Painful Choice, but these cards didn't really start to become super powerful until they decided that certain types of cards were going to be what they focused on. I think that when cards started being printed that had a lot more interaction from the grave, cards like Painful Choice became too strong. Cards like Foolish Burial needed to be restricted. Rhoda, Terraforming. They started printing cards that you can not only search, but then those cards also search, and then they also gain you more advantage, and they have upside, and they allow you to OTK more easily and stuff like that. A lot of that is a problem if you're not into the idea of Yu-Gi-Oh as a very fast-paced, very like swingy type of game. But I think that ultimately there's not a lot that can be done about it. It needs to differentiate itself from Magic and Pokemon. And one of the big ways that it does that is not requiring any sort of mana. But another big way that it does that is by sort of leaning more heavily into the idea of sort of comboing, being able to, I know MBT compared Yu-Gi-Oh to like a fighting game. Being able to like hit, let that like, combo into another hit, and then sort of, building it up to the point where you can sort of overwhelm your opponent. But unlike a fighting game, you know, you have the ability to sort of block at strategic times that there isn't really a point in time where your opponent has snowballed so much that you can't undo what they've done, because Konami has printed a lot of blowout cards that sort of answer a lot of situations. Like you can ash their first action, or you can wait for them to overextend and play into Nibiru, or you can wait, let them activate a bunch of effects on your turn, and then Kurikara them. Like there's a lot of stuff that's been printed that sort of makes going second better and makes the idea of overextending, comboing off into oblivion, it makes those things less good. And I think that that's sort of how they sort of balance that. IDK, man, the speed is kind of what draws me to this game. Thank you. Like, there is not any reason to play Yu-Gi-Oh over other card games except for the fact that it's faster paced and it's just very swingy and has a lot of blowouts. If you don't like that, then you probably don't like Yu-Gi-Oh. If you're trying to force Yu-Gi-Oh to play more like Magic, then just go play Magic. Like, it's as simple as that, right? I don't think that that's like a complicated thing to think. The two big culprits IMO are the fact that it's too easy to summon the strongest monsters in one turn and all the cards that sidestep the rules. I think cards that sidestep the rules are based and fun. And the fact that you can get these big, powerful monsters on the field very easily means that any individual monster's power is suddenly being judged differently, right? Like there was a point in time where Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, was the strongest thing you could be summoning. Getting a light and a dark in the grave was suddenly like, oh no, I'm being like, I can threaten BLS at any time. But now it's like BLS is just fine. Like, it's an okay monster, I guess, but like the fact is that in a game where you can drop access code talker on somebody, the quality of cards have improved so drastically that any individual card's power is now being judged differently, right? So, like, take for example a card like Chaos Dragon Levianeer. If Chaos Dragon Levianeer was printed at the time when Chaos cards were actually seeing a lot of play, I feel like it would have been like a staple. Every deck would have played it no matter what. It would have made Chaos the strongest deck by a wide margin. But as it stands, Dragon Link doesn't even play Levianeer anymore. Unless I missed something, like nobody plays it. And the fact is that yes, Levianeer is still a strong card, but there are other cards that are stronger. So like, is it a strong card? Like, is it a powerful boss monster? Really? Like, the bar has been raised, right? If you're considering something like, I don't know, if you're considering something like the Chaos Dragon prize card as a strong card, or if you're considering something like Borreload, a strong boss monster, like he's been power crept even at this point. Borrel's Sword has been power crept at this point. Decks don't play either of those cards anymore. So what powerful boss monsters are you saying are easy to summon? Sure, Access Code Talker is easy to summon. I would say that's fair. But it still isn't like, it's not like you just draw for turn and then you drop an Access Code Talker on somebody. Like, there are things that happen between drawing your cards and summoning Access Code Talker that give a person room to interact. Like, even when the Access Code Talker is summoned, it still like gives you the opportunity to interact.
This is Walgreens with a refill reminder for Zachary McKee. If this is Zachary McKee, press 1. If not, press 2. If you'd like to opt out of future reminder calls from Walgreens, press 7. Okay, to ensure your confidentiality, please enter your date of birth using 2 digits. The birth date you entered doesn't match our records. You entered 10301991. Please try again. Please enter your date of birth using 2 digits for the month, 2 for the date, and 4 for the year. Great. According to our records, you have 1 prescription that needs to be refilled. To refill your prescription for atomoxetine, 80 milligram capsules with 1 refill remaining, press 1. If you'd rather not refill it now, press 2. Okay, you've chosen not to refill any of your prescriptions right now. When you decide to refill, please go to Walgreens.com or your local Walgreens pharmacy to refill your prescriptions. Thanks for choosing Walgreens.
Let's text my wife back before she thinks I'm ignoring her. Let's go ahead and read the rest of this comment. While they were making the game, they really should have tried harder to control the power creep and also not release cards that sidestep the rules or the point of some card types. Okay, I forgot about the sidestepping the rules thing. So I think one of the coolest things that Yu-Gi-Oh does is sort of find interesting ways to like subvert the existing rules. Like, for example, cards that special summon fusion cards without fusion monster, like without fusing monster cards. I think that that's cool. I really like instant fusion as a concept. I really, really like ready fusion as a concept. I also love fusion armament. I think that card is stupid as hell, but I think it's so interesting. The space that it opens up for being able to summon monsters from the extra deck for free. The fact is that summoning fusion monsters or really any extra deck monster uh, without properly summoning it, you can do it in like one of three basic ways, and all three of them are bangers. You can either use a card that basically allows you to summon them, but like puts a lot of restrictions on what actually can be summoned. Like, yes, Instant Fusion's a broken card, but it can only summon level 5 or lowers, and it destroys it during the end phase. And like, I think it's neat to be able to like find ways to work around those restrictions. Like in Orcus, when you would summon Winda and then use Dingirsu's protection effect to stop it from being destroyed by the effect of Instant Fusion, that is really cool. That's a banger. The second way that you can do it is sort of by, your opponent playing into certain things. Like, your opponent activates Lightning Storm and you have Waking the Dragon set. You deserve to summon an Ultimate Falcon. Your opponent went like +3 off of that Lightning Storm. You deserve a Towers, right? I think that's fair. So I think that cards like that are fine. And the third way is usually some type of like in-archetype sort of workaround. Like with the Zark support, the trap card that summons Zark but negates its effects. I think that's fine. And I think it's really funny, just absolutely hilarious, that I think it's Beyond the Pendulum has an effect where Pendulum monsters' effects can't be negated. So you can like summon Zark off the trap, but then Beyond makes it where it's no longer negated by the trap. That's hilarious. That slaps. I'm absolutely all for it. So I think sidestepping it in that way is fine. Or cards that deal damage based on their attack without even entering a battle phase. I could go on, but there are countless examples. What are you talking about? What the hell? Are you talking about Ring of Destruction? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about like... What are you talking about? What effect damage are you talking about? Like, effect damage does not even matter. Basically, I think fun duels would last a lot longer if the game wasn't the lawless game it is now. It's not... You can criticize Yu-Gi-Oh! All you want, but there are rules, okay? There are restrictions, there are regulations, there are limits within which you have to be. So I don't think that calling the game lawless is fair. Like, the whole point of Xyz was to overlay minimum 2 cards, but then you had rank 12 behemoths that you could summon by overlaying 1. Defeats the whole overlay 3 level 12 mobsters challenge you were supposed to go through. This has existed pretty much since Xyz came out. Like, how many Xyz monsters have insurmountable materials but say this card can also be slapped on top of another monster from the archetype? Bujins did it, Constellars did it. Like, you're talking clearly about Zeus, but Zeus is not even the first example of this. The worst example is Zodiac. Zodiac, the entire point of the deck was you summon a Zodiac monster, and then you can just summon every other Zodiac Xyz on top of it. And honestly, Zeus existing was part of the reason why they rebanned Trident, was because having the ability to end on a Trident turn 1, and then use it as a Trident, and then turn 3, slap a Zeus on top of it if you can't kill your opponent. Like, you could have like a 15 material Zeus. But Zeus is not the end all be all. There are ways to play around it. And since Zodiac got Trident banned, nobody can even end on a Zeus that can really do more than 2 activations. And if your deck can't play through 2 Zeus activations, you're probably not winning anyway, right? Like, there are a lot of decks that can play through 2 Zeus board wipes. Because the fact is that this is not the end all be all in terms of Xyz. Like, the entire point of the Utopia deck is just ranking up without rank up spells. And sometimes you use rank up spells, but most of the time you don't. I mean, Utopia the Lightning existed a long time ago, even before Zodiacs. You summon a Utopia and then you slap it on top of it. And yes, Zodiac having one card Xyz is a problem. That's why they have like 3 cards banned, okay? You're talking about these things as if they haven't been hit. Zeus hasn't existed long enough to see any sort of significant hits. It's limited in the OCG, it's limited in Master Duel. Like, what do you want them to do? They probably will ban it at some point. But in the meantime, let's just, have fun with it while we can. It doesn't feel fast. It feels like they activate 1 or 2 hand traps that either get negated or go through, but it doesn't matter as my opponent has another 1-card combo, which leads me to just sitting there watching someone set up cards. That you're not playing the right hand traps. If you hand trap your opponent twice and they're still playing, you either didn't hand trap in the right place or you aren't playing the right hand traps. That or your opponent's just playing a deck that can play through a lot of interaction and they drew the God hand. That can't be helped. That just happens sometimes. You just gotta take those, unfortunately. Fusion summoning monsters using materials still in your deck is crazy to me. Yeah, I will say that I like the fact that some decks can fusion from deck. I think that there are more interesting ways to circumvent the fusion mechanic. I mentioned earlier about the whole prank kids trying to sort of circumvent the loss of card advantage from fusion summoning using a fusion spell. They printed the new Chimera stuff, Chimera Fusion. That card does not fusion from deck. Pretty much the only way to make a fusion spell worth playing is to fusion from deck these days. But you can do a lot of work on the materials effects when they're fusion summoned. And the fact that Chimera Fusion recycles itself means that it sort of does what the Drytron ritual spell tries to do, namely that you activate it and then you can just basically return it to your hand for free, and then you can activate it again. And the materials all float. The only issue is that the Chimera archetype doesn't have enough main deck monsters to really make itself like a fully fledged deck yet. I think that with maybe 1 or 2 more waves of support, that deck will be insane. But as it is, it's just okay. And I agree that printing cards that just fusion from deck is silly. I think that the restrictions of Shadal Fusion made it a little more balanced, and the fact that all of the Shadals floated meant that even fusion summoning from hand with something like a Shadal Fusion without an extra deck monster in your opponent's field or activating like El Shadal Fusion, the fact that all of them replace themselves in some way, either through, destroying something your opponent controlled, adding another card, giving you another send from deck, like, that's fine, right? I think that it made fusion summoning a little bit better. The fact that you could do it from deck was a little silly, but there were ways to play around it. Branded Fusion and like Fusion Destiny and Red Eyes Fusion, these are cards that have restrictions, but the restrictions ultimately don't matter, especially in the decks that these cards see play. Like locking you into heroes. Oh no, what will I do in my hero deck? Oh no, I can't normal summon or special summon anymore. Guess I'll just play Red Eyes Fusion and Guru and set. Like, oh no, I can only summon fusion monsters in my fusion deck. My extra deck is like 15 fusion cards. Oh no, what will I do? So it's like, yes, there is a huge problem with printing fusion cards that fusion from deck. But at this point, the only way to make fusions worth playing is to no longer force people to do the traditional fusion summoning. You can print archetypes that sort of make fusioning from hand more appealing, but for a long time they've been printing cards that didn't fusion summon from hand and field. Like, look at a card like Miracle Fusion. Like, fusioning using materials in Grave, honestly just as broken as fusioning from deck in some scenarios. Like, all it is just yet another way that they're trying to circumvent the need for lost card advantage. You're using materials in a place that the cards don't necessarily matter, right? They're just not, they're either in deck as cards you would have access to later, or they're in grave as cards you've already used. Obviously, I don't think that Miracle Fusion is equally as strong as Branded Fusion, but I'm saying that they both do functionally the same thing, and they try and circumvent the fact that fusion summoning is a huge neg. And the fact is, the best fusion deck of all time, Tier Limit, didn't even have a fusion spell. Every monster in the archetype, barring Rhino Heart and the Kashtira one, were all fusion spells. So, where is my ritual summon with material from deck? Advanced ritual art. Thank you, Fred. Depends what you mean by fast. Turn count, number of actions when a player surrenders, compared to what? If it's compared to any other game, you don't have resources that you wait before you can combo OTK the opponent, but the BS level is the same. It's just padding. But if you mean within Yu-Gi-Oh, players are forced to play in a ridiculously all-in fashion. It grants the higher chance of survival/success, which always leads to games determined immediately because you can amass lethal or interaction so easily that one card drawn doesn't cut it. Be it for the second player not having enough to play through, or the first one on their second turn being met with just enough they can't come back. I think there's truth to that, but I think that most players, if they're not going to be able to play through their opponent's field, know that before the turn rolls around. Strategic scooping and not giving your opponent information is one of the cool things about playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think the fact that games are all in, honestly, most games nowadays aren't even all in. I think that there's some decks that do sort of, spit their hand on the field, but those decks aren't even really the best decks in the room. I think that decks like Kashtira, decks like Pertly, decks like even Super Heavy Samurai to a certain extent, which is a deck that functions with like pendulums and stuff, still ends on cards in hand. They all play hand traps, right? So it's like we aren't really in a format where you spit your hand on the field. Those formats are in the past, right? And those weren't even super oppressive. I think at its strongest, Thunder Dragon Link was ending on a floodgate, a floodgate, a negate or two, and a bounce. But there were a lot of points in that deck where you could force your opponent to end on fewer interaction. But that format was what necessitated Konami printing cards like Dark Ruler No More and Nibiru, cards that made going second better and made all-in combo decks worse. Like a lot of decks are gate kept out of the format because of the fact that they crumble to cards like Nibiru. And they just keep printing cards like this, like Kurikara, Div Incarnate, that sort of punish people for playing these all-in, no-holds-barred, balls-to-the-wall combo decks. So I think that, in my opinion, Konami doesn't like these decks just as much as we don't. So that's the Reddit post. I'll go ahead and give this guy an upvote because this was a cool sort of discussion. Is the game too fast? Depends on who you ask. Did anybody in this comment section have meaningful points? A couple people had some good points. I think most of the people in this comment section were here just to whine, which is fair. I love whining. I love complaining. But ultimately, I don't think anybody here had anything to say that I hadn't already heard. So that's the video. I will see you guys in the next one. Don't forget to subscribe and, stay fast.